Welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to be talking about Palestine in Israeli school books, ideology and propaganda in education. The author's name is Nurit Peled-Elhanan. Another book by an Israeli Jew, which I think is a good follow-up to the recent review that I did on Love Israel, Support Palestine, written by an IDF reserve officer. This book is, in a sense, a natural complement. The question is, where did these young Israeli children, who would then become soldiers, get their ideas? From school books. And so what this very short study goes into is the different ways in which Israelis and the very rare times they're called Palestinians are portrayed in school books and what that means for the way people are educated. And then that translates into how Israeli society is conducted today. So I'm going to divide this review into three parts. First, I'm going to talk about some general ways that the school books in Israel are you could say framed. Secondly, I'm going to talk about how that flows out into some attitudes that you're going to find in Israel today. And then I'm going to give you some examples from the book. It's harder to do in a format like this, but I will do my best to show some of the examples that she gives. So we'll start at the beginning with what she says the goal of her book is. The concern of the present study is not to describe Israeli education as a whole, but rather to focus on one specific question. How are Palestine and the Palestinians, against whom these young Israelis will potentially be required to use force, portrayed in school books? And if you understand and see that, then it makes a lot more sense when you realize these are attitudes they've had from their earliest days. Israeli textbooks play a dual role. On the one hand, they provide a sense of continuity between past and present, transmitting accepted historical narratives. On the other, they alter and rewrite the past in order to suit contemporary needs. Since the state controls the educational apparatus, it can shape the nation's collective memory by determining what is to be included and what excluded from the curricula and from textbooks. Such a course of action opens the way for the manipulation of the past in order to mold the present and the future. Studies show that Israeli school books aim to inculcate the collective memory created by Zionism, which constitutes an entirely novel Jewish collective memory. Israeli school books of history, geography, civics, literature, and even science and grammar promulgate in one way or another the Zionist grand narrative, made of two dichotomist parts. The narrative of decline from the golden age of antiquity through exile to its culmination in the Holocaust, and a narrative of progress beginning with the Zionist return to the land of Israel as an act leading toward national redemption. This narrative includes both the denial of 2,000 years of Jewish life in exile and the denial of any meaningful life in Palestine during the same period. In this grand narrative of return and redemption, the hero is the new Jew who returned to reclaim his homeland and retrieve it from the Arab invaders. As was mentioned above, the cult of Jewish continuity in the land of Israel-Palestine also includes obliterating all signs of Palestinian continuous existence on the land. Regarding this obliteration, literary scholar Ariel Hirschfeld comments that the Zionist creed, "Know Your Homeland," means forgetting 2,000 years of civilization on this land and seeing present Jewish life in Israel as a direct continuation of the biblical kingdom of Judea. Indeed, the 2,000 years of Jewish absence from the land, whose negation is one of the most important Zionist tenets, are literally bracketed in school books. So here are some basic assumptions about what exists in texts. Jewish historical rights to the land of Israel, Arab threat and hatred and world anti-Semitism. The Arabs have 21 countries and we have only one. Palestinian citizens constitute a demographic problem which can expand into a demographic threat unless controlled. Palestinians in the occupied territories are a constant threat and must be controlled, otherwise they would slaughter us. What is good and desirable? A Jewish state, a Jewish majority, Israeli control. As we shall see later, Israeli actions are usually presented in history books as right morally, according to universal and Jewish norms, while Palestinian actions are presented as whimsical or vicious. Israel reacts to Arab hostility, performs operations in their midst, and executes punitive deterring actions against Palestinian terror, while the Arabs murder Israelis, commit terror actions against Israel, take revenge, and use what they call their suffering in anti-Israeli propaganda. So just in that little paragraph, you can see the framing devices. So Israel reacts to Arab hostility. It makes the Arabs the aggressors, which, as we know, is the opposite of the reality. Performs operations in their midst. What are those operations? The murder of women and children. Executes punitive deterring actions, destroying civilian infrastructure. While the Arabs murder Israelis, commit terror actions against Israel, take revenge, and what they call their suffering. What they call their suffering. Internationally recognized genocide. As already noted, the label Palestinian is hardly ever used in school books for naming the Palestinian occupied territories or the Palestinians themselves. In Israeli social, political, and educational discourse, Palestinian citizens are called by the demeaning label Israel's Arabs. The Palestinians in the occupied territories are labeled, in addition to Arabs, either Palestinaim in Hebrew or Palestinim, according to the speaker's or writer's political inclinations. Usually, the left-wing oriented voices would call them Palestinim, which is equal to Palestinians, or in the Arabic pronunciation, Falastinians, as they call themselves. The right-wing oriented voices would call them Arabs or Palestinaim, which is closer to Philistines, and it can be translated as Philistinians. And there, if you make the link, it has a powerful biblical and religious link in the Jewish mind of enemies of the Jewish people. And you can just see there in just a little variation in the way that the word is formed, not only who you are in Israeli society by the way that how you refer to the Palestinians, but what that other choice that you make. If you don't use what the Palestinians call themselves, you use something that has a powerful trigger in Jewish religious memory, which, as I've said before, there's no coherence to a Jew that claims to be an atheist. A Jew is definitionally related to the religion. If you ask a Jew, well, what does it mean to be Jewish? By the way, you can't mention anything that has to do with religion, since you're an atheist. Then I don't know what they'd be able to tell you. There's no reference, no cultural, no any kind. There's no reference to Judaism that isn't religious. It is quintessentially a religion that's tied to an ethnicity. The national solution of Israel's Arabs is elsewhere. In order to maintain a Jewish democratic state, we must constitute two nation states with clear red lines. Once this happens, I will be able to come to the Palestinian citizens of Israel, whom we label Israel's Arabs, and tell them that their national solution is elsewhere. This is a quote from Tzipi Livni when she was the Minister of Foreign Affairs. And this is an example of the framing. She says, I'm going to come to Israel's Arabs and tell them that there is a solution to their problem. There is an ongoing problem. In most of the books studied here, the label Palestinian is mainly reserved for terrorists. And then there's a bunch of examples there of every time it's used, which I'm sure you can guess. Presenting the Palestinian areas as controlled by the Palestinian Authority, instead of as their native land, and the people who live there as foreign workers, emphasizes the idea that the Palestinians do not belong where they have lived for centuries. The only book that uses the label Palestinians consistently is World of Changes, which was interdicted. She refers to this earlier in the book. This book was stopped at the printers and not allowed to be distributed when they found out it cited the Palestinians' point of view in some of the text. That is a terrible idea. Can't be allowed. This book labels the conflict the Zionist-Palestinian conflict and the 1948 war a civil war instead of the War of Independence. It is the only book that calls the pre-Israel territory Palestina as it was actually called, instead of mandatory Israel, as it is called in other school books. When I found this out, it's called mandatory Israel. There is no such thing. There was no mandatory Israel. But even here in their school books, they're presenting lies. This is just a straight inaccuracy. It was never called mandatory Israel. No one in the entire world called it mandatory Israel, but they have to call it that so that they can prepare young children's minds to say, well, this was always our land. It was mandatory Israel. It presents the two adversary sides symmetrically and gives almost equal weight to their arguments and their national claims. Furthermore, World of Changes is the only book in this study where the Palestinian occupied territories are named the West Bank and not Judea and Samaria, or the western land of Israel, as in 50 Years in other books. Destroyed Palestinian villages are mentioned by their original names, and even 1948 Eilat, this is the port way down in the south, is called by its Arabic name Rashrash, as it was called at the time. Since the position of the present study is that no sign is neutral and every sign is motivated by interest and ideology, the mixture of labels is perceived as motivated not only by disrespect for the name the Palestinian people have chosen for themselves, but also by the perception that it doesn't matter what they call themselves. For us, they are merely Arabs. This perception nourishes the arguments used in Israeli popular and political discourse for barring the return of the Palestinian refugees, along with the argument that Arabs should not be allowed to return to Israel after many Jews were expelled from Arab countries such as Morocco, Iraq, and Syria. There's a couple things we need to talk about there. If you say that the Palestinians are merely Arabs, they have no claim to this land, then they're trying to say the reciprocal argument of, look at all these Jews that were expelled from Morocco, Iraq, Syria, we took them in. That's what you all should do to your people. Not making the connection of why were those Jews kicked out of those countries. It was in reaction, I'm not saying it's right, I'm saying it was in reaction to what they did to the Palestinians. So if you successfully tell and brainwash your people they're just Arabs, they can go to any Arab country, then you delete the idea of them being Palestinians and having a tie to this specific country. So that's their argument. We took in Jews from all around the world. You people, you should take your fellow Arabs in, and you're the ones who are prolonging this conflict because you don't care about the Palestinians. This is one of the ways that they're going to make that argument. You have to be prepared for that by making sure that you study the history of this time period. From this point of view, authorized Israeli textbooks describing the Palestinians in ways that are typical of racist representation include the words primitive, subservient, deviant, criminal, evil, and as a problem to be solved. This should not be treated merely as a reflection of the writer's personal opinions, but as a reflection of a large swathe of the official Israeli attitude towards the Palestinians as a whole. Where did they learn it? They learned it at school. Who determines what is taught in school? The Israeli government. As we shall see later, the geography of hostility and exclusion. Geography textbooks discredit Palestinian agriculture as non-developed or unmodern. This description conceals the Israeli system of inequality which compels the Palestinian citizens to do with much fewer resources, less funds, water, and land than their Jewish co-citizens. Well, look how primitive they are. There's nothing saying, look how primitive they are when we steal their water and make sure that they can't buy modern implements. As will be made clear in the following chapters, basic tenets of prejudice are compatible with Israeli attitude towards Palestinian Arab citizens and non-citizens as reflected in school books, including 1. A feeling of superiority, which in Israeli social discourse and textbooks is expressed by the narrative of Jewish/Western progress. In this narrative, the Jews are the representatives of the West and hence of progress, while the non-Jews or Arabs represent the Orient and hence backwardness. This is written by, this quote's from Tom Segev, who, one of my favorite authors from this area. This is the basic assumption of the Zionist project since its onset. We are the representatives of enlightenment and progress, rational sophistication and morality, and the Arabs are a primitive rabble, tempestuous and violent, ignorant boys who should be tamed and educated by our wisdom, like rapes. And this, needless to say, by the stick and carrot method, as the donkey driver treats his donkey. So firstly, a feeling of superiority. Secondly, perception of the subordinate race as intrinsically different and alien. This perception is tightly connected to the first one and is expressed in Israeli school books in classifications and in generalized observations such as the Arab society is traditional and objects to changes by its nature, is reluctant to adopt novelties, modernization seems dangerous to them. 3. A feeling of proprietary claim to certain areas of privilege and advantage, which in Israel pertain to land, immigration rights exclusively given to Jews by the law of return, hailed in all school books, to budgets and municipal services, to national identity, and to cultural dominance. In school books, this feeling is most apparent in the repeated statement about the exclusive Jewish rights on the entire land of Israel and Palestine, expressed both verbally and in the maps which depict Palestinian lands as part of the State of Israel, although they have never been annexed by law. And finally, fear and suspicion that the subordinate race covets the prerogatives of the dominant race. In the Israeli context, this fear relates to personal and municipal expansion, professional and political advancement, national and cultural rights, and the commemoration of the Palestinian catastrophe, the Nakba, on Jewish Independence Day. So all of these things have to be suppressed if you're going to suppress the other. You have to have a feeling of superiority. You have to have a perception of the subordinate race as intrinsically different and alien. They have to be controlled. A feeling of proprietary claim to certain areas of privilege, and fear and suspicion that this subordinate race covets the prerogatives of the dominant race. And there's a certain logic there. You are the occupiers. But as I say, we're just trying to talk about some basic ideas here. Labeling a nation a problem is disturbing, and even more so finding it in a Jewish textbook only 60 years after the Jews were called the Jewish problem. As I've said often on this channel, there is simply no self-awareness among Zionists, along with no ability to self-criticize or to accept criticism from others. The Palestinian collective never receives any positive attributes or any effective or cognitive verbs, which implies that these people never think rationally or feel anything. As a rule, Arabs and Palestinians don't do much in Israeli school books except for lurking, attacking, in all sorts of ways, and multiplying. The few transitive verbs I came across regarding this unanimous group of people included poison, attack, refuse, evade tax payment, and thank Israel for the progress it has brought into their life. For example, in one textbook, there are only 2 photographs of Palestinians, one of face-covered Palestinian children throwing stones at, quote, our forces. But the forces, jeeps or tanks, revealed in the Palestinian reproduction of this photograph are not shown, probably because showing them would turn the picture into Little Davids against Goliath, and would obviously miss the point of depicting these children as terrorists. Right? If you're throwing a rock at an armored vehicle, and you're unarmed, other than the rock, you are considered a terrorist. All right. This particular part that I'm going to read is one of the most important insights I got into the book. And I've read this fact before, but this was tied together in a way that I hadn't thought of before, and I was really appreciative of it. The author says, at this point, I must be allowed a personal note. Time was against them, as a phrase, is marked by a certain undertone that may not come through in the translation, but which I recall from my own days at school during the 1950s to 1960s, an undertone of joy and triumph. She was in Israel in the 1950s and 60s. When I was growing up, the current popular argument was, they deserted their houses and their lands, so we can take hold of them. Finders keepers, losers weepers. The relevance of this undertone for the present analysis is that it may explain to an outsider the connotation of the verbs abandon or desert that are constantly used in school books to describe the Palestinian exodus. Desertion, panicked flight, and abandon convey negative evaluation of tenacity and capacity. According to Israeli norms, since the Palestinians abandoned their land, they do not deserve to have it back. Abandoning the land also contradicts the Palestinian norm of sumud, adopted by the Palestinian national movement, which means clinging to the soil of the homeland at all costs. Hence, in addition to the deep insult embodied in verbs such as desert and abandon, Israeli education and public discourse try to convince the young generations of Palestinians that their parents or grandparents have deserted the land, and therefore they have lost the right to return. Now, in Benny Morris's 1948, which I'll put a card to that video, I think the 3 or 4 times a kibbutzim or a moshavov asked to retreat or asked to surrender, they were told no by Haganah Central Command. The idea was, this is our land, we are going to die here, we're not leaving. And they were never allowed to surrender, even if they were massacred, which, as I say, didn't really occur. There was one time I can think of where they were surrendered and their occupants became prisoners of war. But there's only really 3 or 4 times during 1948 that this happens. And that was the command. All of these kibbutzim had been given weapons, they had been given training, and they had been told what to do. That was not the case for the Arab villages, so it was not a question of 50-50, and this is how it worked on both sides. So on the Israeli side, there was very much a sense of urgency. It doesn't matter if you die, you're not going to abandon your kibbutz. It was not that case on the other side. The Arabs didn't have weapons, they didn't have training, and they were the ones who were being attacked by people who did have weapons and did have training. And so they were running away from being slaughtered. Whereas that wasn't exactly what was happening. The kibbutz had weapons and they were fighting back. And they were told that they couldn't leave. So in that frame, I really understand, and this brings it home to me now, why the Israelis have such contempt for the way that the Arabs acted. However, it's simply unfair because the framing's not equal. It wasn't the same as what they had. They had weapons and they had training and they were prepared for what was coming. That was not the case for the Arab villagers, the Palestinians who were there. They didn't have weapons, they didn't have training, and really they didn't know that they were going to be ethnically cleansed. Some may have suspected it. But that's part of it. You left, and in our world, that is the worst thing that you can do. Didn't matter that you didn't have weapons, didn't matter that you didn't have training. You should have just died there in your houses, and then we would have taken it over from you anyway. Which is a silly argument, but it's a key one, and it's something that you have to understand if you're going to be talking with a Zionist or talking with an Israeli. That for them is an open and shut case. You left your house, that means it's ours. End of story. So, doesn't mean you agree with it, but if you don't understand it, you won't be able to engage with them. So once you say, I understand what you're talking about, but let me walk you through a couple things and see if you can agree or disagree, and explain they didn't have weapons, they didn't have training, and you went on an offense, and they never did. The ideological basis of geography teaching in Israel consists of the Zionist message regarding the redemption and resettlement of the homeland by the children of Israel who, possessing exclusive historical rights to the land, have returned home after 2,000 years of exile. The Jewish ethno-nation is consolidated by the blurring of differences between different Jewish ethnicities, while non-Jews as a whole are segregated and marginalized. At the level of ethnoclass, members of the Jewish ethnoclass are privileged, while the non-Jewish ethnoclasses are underprivileged. Arabs are marginalized in Israeli school books as they are excluded from Israeli cultural discourse and social life. For example, in a history book for grades 8 and 9, we learn that in the years 1881 to 1882, thousands of people arrived at Jaffa port from Russia, from Romania, from the Balkan, and even from faraway Yemen. Needless to say, Yemen is closer to Jaffa port than Russia, but on the mental map of the book's authors, and of the numerous committee members and counselors who authorized it, the center is still Eastern Europe, the spiritual center of Zionism, and the origin of the dominant social group in Israel. So, Avi Shleim and others talk about this idea of the de-Arabization of the Jews who lived in Arab countries, that when they came to Israel, they were basically told to wash all that Arab out of them. We are part of this blurred Jewish identity, and we don't want to have anything to do with the Arabs, even though those who had lived with the Arabs for centuries, they had similar musical tastes and food and customs and practices and dress, but that all had to be gotten rid of because that would associate you with them, and we don't want to be associated with those people. So remember, I told you earlier, World of Changes was one of these books that was taken off the shelf. This gives a little bit of a post-mortem. One of the reasons the book was collected off the shelves as soon as it was published was because the book presented the Palestinian version regarding the ethnic cleansing in 1948 alongside the Israeli one, using both Israeli and Palestinian sources, such as Walid Khalidi's books. The change requested by the Ministry of Education was first of all to remove the Palestinian sources from the Palestinian version and to substitute it either with Palestinian texts that are more faithful to reality or with Israeli sources. The reason given was that the writers had not considered the power of the Palestinian texts and the effect that they might have on the students. You mean like waking them up to what actually happened? One argument was that presenting Arab propaganda as equal in value to the Israeli version is like presenting the Nazi version as equal to that of the Jews regarding the Holocaust. They've always got to go there, right? In order to have the book republished, the authors replaced the Palestinian sources with Israeli ones in the section called the Palestinian version and gave it less weight without changing the structure. In other words, they reproduced a mock exposition. This incident manifests the social importance of genre. Okay, so I just glazed over, as I say, there's a lot more here, but I just glazed over parts and ways in which the Palestinians are not sometimes even called Palestinians, not allowed to be called Palestinians, but are framed in such a way as to be backwards animals who have to be subjugated because otherwise they're going to come murder us in our beds. That's what they dream of every day. And what does that translate into when these people grow up, become adults, and live in Israeli society? The most dominant discourse in Israel with regard to the occupation of Palestine is the discourse of security, which legitimates aspects of Israeli behavior towards Palestinians that are denounced in the framework of the discourse of human rights. In Israeli textbooks, acts of terror and weapon smuggling committed by Jewish underground forces and gangs such as the Haganah, the Irgun Etzel, and Lehi, also known as the Stern Gang, against British occupation and against the Palestinian resistance to Zionism before the establishment of Israel are glorified within the discourse of Jewish emancipation and redemption, while the same acts committed by Palestinians against Israeli occupation are presented in criminal terms. Total lack of self-awareness. Israeli Jewish consciousness is characterized by blind patriotism, belligerence, self-righteousness, dehumanization of the Palestinians, and insensitivity to their suffering. Have we not been seeing this since October 2023? In every single news release, video from officials in the Israeli government. Blind patriotism, belligerence, self-righteousness, dehumanization of the Palestinians, and insensitivity to their sufferings. A survey led by the Magar Mahot Institute in Tel Aviv University revealed in February 2010 that 50% of Israeli Jewish high school students believe Palestinian citizens should not be granted equal civil rights, and 56% believe they should not be allowed to be elected to the Knesset. The survey emphasizes the significant relation between these positions and Jewish religiosity. For instance, 82% of the religious students and 39% of the secular ones believed Palestinian citizens should be denied civil rights. Similarly, 82% of the religious students and 47% of the secular ones believe Palestinian citizens should not be allowed to be elected to the Knesset. I once again draw a connection to those who say this is about Zionism, it's not about Judaism. Well, then why is it that the religious students believe Palestinian citizens should be denied civil rights? 82% of that 50% who believe they should not be granted equal civil rights. The religious ones, not the secular ones. 82% of the religious students believe Palestinian citizens should not be allowed to be elected to the Knesset. Do you want to keep telling me about how Zionism and Judaism have no relationship to each other? As I said, there is clearly a difference between what Zionism is and what Judaism is. But you don't have to be a Zionist in order to support Zionism. There are plenty of Jews who passively support Zionism by not opposing their government's policies, which are hyper-Zionist, I would say. Although the Arabs make up 20% of the population, they have only 3.5% of the land. Over a half of landowners were expropriated by the state after 1948, and more than 500 Jewish settlements were built on these lands. Since its establishment, the state has built over 700 Jewish localities and 0 Arab localities. Although the Arab population has grown sixfold by 2006, the land under its control has halved. This situation creates virtual ghettoization of Arabs. And once again, no self-awareness of the people who lived in ghettos putting other people in ghettos and complaining about injustice and then inflicting that injustice on other peoples. Israeli high school students who are about to become soldiers are taught that the very existence of Palestinians in our midst is a problem that must be solved. And if a problem has to be solved, you can sometimes take extreme measures to solve that problem. Contrary to the conclusions drawn by others, explicit means of demonization are not absent from the 1994 to 2010 school books. We find the most blatant comparisons of Palestinians with Nazis or the devil. For instance, the Prime Minister saw in Arafat the embodiment of Hitler. Or, Arafat was considered as the personification of Satan and the PLO as a clan of murderers. Or, the action in Lebanon seemed to Prime Minister Menachem Begin as a salvation war that would save Israel from a second Auschwitz. Again, this isn't in some pamphlet that you'd find on a street corner. This is in a school book. What adults in Israel believe Israeli youth should know about their Palestinian neighbors is tightly connected with these adults' conviction that Palestinians should be eliminated or at least excluded, marginalized, segregated, and controlled. The authority of the political echelons is used to legitimate the expulsion or at least to present it as a necessary evil, in that it is compatible with statements about present-day extrajudicial assassinations and other forms of aggression against Palestinians. For instance, a report about a 10-year-old Palestinian boy who was shot in Nalin while trying to push away the soldiers from his brother in a rally against the apartheid wall ended with the words, "The IDF says the shooting was done according to regulations," and that in the Israeli discourse of legitimation is enough to exonerate the shooters. So no other context is given. It was done according to regulations, not the regulations are flawed, this is a problem, it's immoral, the laws should be changed. It's, yeah, we shot some 10-year-old unarmed kid who was trying to defend his brother. That's totally normal. It was done according to regulations. I was just following orders. Once again, no self-awareness. One should bear in mind that the ethnic cleansing of Palestine in 1948 and in 1967 have not yet become history in the Israeli discourse or practice, and the refusal to take responsibility for the Palestinian refugees bears on the contemporary policies of Israel versus the Palestinian population within the borders of the state and in the occupied territories. The ever-present plans for real and retroactive transfer, the expulsion of the Druze villagers from the Golan, the actual ongoing eviction of Palestinians from their homes in East Jerusalem, of Bedouins from the West Bank and the Negev, the Nakab as well, are all part of the same continuous process of Judaization. I always try to remember the different names for the places, Negev, Nakab, the Israeli name and the Arab name. It's important to study these names so that you have the proper reference. Granting the right of return to Palestinian refugees means recognizing the Palestinian version of the Nakba and allowing it to exist within Israeli discourse and reality. Such recognition, crucial as it is for peace and reconciliation, is still far from being accepted by Israeli educators. So, we've talked about some of the ways that the conflict is being framed in schools. I've talked about how this evolves into the way adults think. So now let's look at some examples of this. And as I said, this format may not be the best to show you what we're looking at, but I'll do my best with the camera. So here you can see a map. Obviously it's in Hebrew, but the totality of what is called occupied Israel, and you see I have an arrow there to the Golan Heights, which is Syria, occupied. And obviously in Hebrew, you're reading from right to left, so that's where the text is. So I don't read Hebrew. Many of you probably don't read Hebrew, so I'm going to read you what it says here in translation. Exodus 23:31, "And I will set thy bounds from the sea of Suf," which is the Red Sea, even to the sea of the Pelishtim, the southern shores of the Mediterranean, and from the desert to the river. Deuteronomy 11:24. Every place whereon the sole of your foot shall tread shall be yours. From the river Prath, to the uttermost sea shall be your border. Joshua 1:4. From the wilderness and this Lebanon as far as the great sea, towards the going down of the sun shall be your border. However, only the verse regarding the spreading is interpreted, within brackets into modern Hebrew. The interpretation? In future, your country will expand to the west and to the east, to the north and to the south. Once again, these are not internationally recognized borders. It doesn't include the West Bank, and it doesn't include Gaza, and it includes the Golan Heights. And so Nurit says, the answer to the hypothetical question, why doesn't the map show the internationally recognized borders of Israel, is because the Bible said so. Remember, the Bible is a textbook in Israel, and so it can be used to justify what happened in the Old Testament to what is happening now. Here's another map, and you can see those small dotted areas are where Palestinians live. This is the results of Oslo, and that's a different discussion. But when you see it like that, then it's framed as a problem. We have these little pockets of Palestinians. What are we going to do about that? Its maps include the Palestinian territories that are outside Israel's official borders, but omit Arab cities within Israel, like Nazareth, Acre, or el-Fahim. The areas controlled by the Palestinian authorities are encircled with a very thin broken line, which usually expresses temporariness. Other Palestinian areas which are under military occupation and have never been annexed to Israel are not marked at all and seem as part of the state. Similarly, on another page, the tiniest Jewish university extensions that were erected in the illegal settlements of Ariel, Alon Shvut, or Elkanah, but excludes all major Palestinian universities in the same areas, such as Birzeit, Al-Quds, and Bethlehem University, although these latter universities are much bigger and better known all over the world. This one will be very difficult to see, but you have a Jewish family sitting near a trunk waiting to go somewhere, and then you have these Palestinian refugees. And the text on both sides is trying to contrast these two, all right? The similarity created between the two groups of refugees in this layout is historically accountable. Both groups, the present Jews and the absent Palestinians, were victims of the same sort. Both were driven out of their original homes that were seized and appropriated by those who drove them out in the same political circumstances, Zionism and the establishment of the State of Israel. The taxonomic relations between the two photographs are reinforced by the caption at the right side of the ruined village, which makes the invisible carrier, social exclusion, quite evident. Construction work in the abandoned Palestinian village In Hud, whose name was changed to In Hod in 1949. Although the notion of Palestinian desertion of the land is expressed in the terms abandoned village and abandoned houses, it is problematized by the photograph that shows ruined houses being reconstructed. People who abandon their homes and flee in terror do not raze their village to the ground before they leave. Great point. The caption also reveals, through intertextualization with the Israeli historical and social texts that are only hinted at, which of the alternatives mentioned in the main text regarding both groups of refugees was finally chosen. The Palestinian lands of In Hud were confiscated, and the remaining villagers live to this day on a small part of their previous land as present absentees, deprived of all rights and services, in what is legally called an unrecognized village. Regarding the Jewish refugees, it is well known in Israel that the Jewish village of In Hod, which was rebuilt on most of In Hud's lands, is an exclusive colony of well-known artists and a tourist site, being a hosting village for art exhibitions. And its reconstruction was never meant as a solution for destitute Jewish newcomers from Arab countries like those shown in the photograph. These participants of the so-called mass immigration of the 1950s were lodged for years in temporary refugee camps called mabarot, of tin shacks or tents, and as we find more explicitly in another history school book studied, The newcomers did not choose where to live, and nobody asked for their opinion on the matter, and in many cases their allocation was done through deceit and against their will. We talked about this in Alison Weir's Against Our Better Judgment. I'll put a link to that video as well. More than once, whole families refused to step down from the trucks when they found out where they had been brought to. So there's victimization on both sides as well. Victimization of the people who are forced to come to Israel who didn't really want to come. Remember, we've talked about the being almost press ganged into coming, even though they were very happy in Europe or very happy in other places where they had settled after the war and didn't want to come to Palestine. And then, of course, why would you need to reconstruct a village if people just fled? If you flee, everything should be fine. You don't blow up your village on the way out. But I'm sure they'd find a way to say that was the case. Of course, we can't talk about Israeli school books without talking about massacres, because that's what Zionists do best. And we'll have to talk about a couple of those massacres. Two in particular, the Kibbutz massacre and the Kfar Qasim massacre. So here's just a quick overview historically. On the night between the 12th and 13th of October 1953, Palestinian infiltrators from Jordan killed a woman and her 2 children at their home in Yahud, a former Palestinian village cleansed in 1948 and repopulated by Jewish immigrants. Prior to this killing, IDF Unit 101 had raided the Burj refugee camp in the Gaza Strip, killing 20 people. The Yahud infiltrators escaped to the village of Rantis, 5 kilometers north of Kibbutz. The Prime Minister, Chief of Staff, and other generals decided, without consulting the cabinet, to retaliate. The massacre, called reprisal or retaliation in the public discourse, was committed by Unit 101, which was founded for that purpose, headed by Major Ariel Sharon. The official version claims Sharon was ordered to clear the village and demolish some houses. However, Morris found out, and when we're saying Morris here, it's Benny Morris, found out the order was to commit destruction and maximum killing in order to drive all the inhabitants out of their homes that were to be demolished. 69 people were killed and 45 houses demolished. As news of the massacre emerged, the Israeli government, especially Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion, denied it, stating that all soldiers were at their bases that night and that the massacre was committed by farmers enraged by robberies. These farmers, the announcement said, were Holocaust survivors and newcomers from Arab countries where revenge is common. Later, Ben-Gurion said the soldiers did not know there were people in the houses that night and that most of the victims were persons who were buried under their demolished homes. Later still, he justified the reprisals, saying they restored security both to border settlements and to central Tel Aviv. Lies, cover-up, deception. This is a normal part of how the Israeli government functions. And many other governments as well, but we're speaking about the Israeli government because this is about Israeli school books. There's also the Kfar Qasim massacre. Following upon the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948, the Arab Palestinian citizens were placed under military government, requiring permits to go in and out of their homes. Curfews were laid every night from 7 at night to 6 in the morning. In the lead up to the 1956 war with Egypt, the government and the army devised a Plan Mole, to divert attention from their true intentions and to encourage Palestinians living near the border to flee to Jordan and subsequently block their way back. On the first day of the war, the army decided to advance the daily curfew on Palestinian towns and villages from 7 to 5. But the village Mukhtars were only advised of the change half an hour before its onset, so they could not notify the farmers working in the fields or outside the villages. Nevertheless, the order given by Army Colonel Shadmi was to shoot and kill anyone who would be outside after 5 p.m. Although most junior officers decided not to obey the order, Lieutenant Gabriel Dahan, the commander at the western entrance to Kfar Qasim, stopped the carts, bicycles, and trucks that brought workers back from the fields, ordered the people and their families to stand in line, and instructed his soldiers to cut them down. Within an hour, 47 people, among them 11 children and 17 women, were killed at the northern and western entrances and in the village itself. The bodies were hurriedly buried during the night in the neighboring village of Jaljulia by villagers forced to do the task. After 6 weeks during which the Israeli government denied the event and censored its publication, there was no alternative but to charge the soldiers with murder. The defendants claimed they had obeyed the orders of their superiors, but the judge ruled they should have disobeyed a manifestly unlawful order and sentenced them to jail terms varying between 7 and 17 years. The commanding officer was charged with a fine of £2. They were all released by December 1959 by presidential amnesty, and their ranks were restored to them. Gabriel Dahan, that was the commanding officer, himself has been appointed delegate of the Jewish Agency in Paris. In 1994, the mayor of Kafir Qasim, Sheikh Darwish Nimer, wrote a letter to Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin requesting state recognition of the massacre, but received no answer. So, how can we justify these massacres? Briefly, the slaughter of for Kibbutz, the slaughter of Palestinians in their homes brought about some confidence to Jews in their homes and restored morale and dignity to the IDF. For the Kafir Qasim massacre, a barbaric crime brought about an enlightened verdict. But is that true? On the day the Sinai campaign started, the curfew was brought forward to an earlier hour, 5 o'clock. That day, workers from Kafir Qasim returned to their homes after curfew without knowing it had been changed. The border guard soldiers who met them at the entrance to the village ordered them to stop, recognized them as the inhabitants of the village, and then shot them dead. They argued they had followed orders to shoot and kill indiscriminately anyone found outside their homes after curfew. 49 citizens of the village, including women and children, were murdered. The Prime Minister denounced the murder. The Knesset stood a whole minute to commemorate the murdered. The defendants were sentenced to prison terms of 7 to 17 years. The judge ruled that a manifestly unlawful order should be clear to every man who is a man. It is a moral test that the eye is not blind and the heart is not corrupt. So they're trying to say, look, it was a terrible thing. We sentenced those people. This is about justice, and don't obey unlawful orders. But what's the actual context to that statement? The report succeeds through a careful process of selection and omission of facts in delegitimizing the act, socially excluding the killers, while legitimating the Israeli government and army and hailing the Israeli court. It foregrounds Israeli judges' courage and moral integrity. For that purpose, the text conceals important facts such as the Prime Minister's order to deny the event for 6 weeks, his refusal to put the army on trial, thereby laying all the blame, as the text does, on the border guards, and thus exonerating the military commanders. The report praises the Prime Minister and the Knesset for commemorating the murdered for a whole minute, but avoids mentioning the murderer's release after a short while. It doesn't mention Colonel Shadmi's penalty of £2 fine, or the fact that all the killers regained their positions in the army and governmental offices with the explicit help of the Prime Minister. It does not mention the overwhelming support of Shadmi by senior officers of the army during the trial, and the worry expressed by one of them after hearing the verdict, "I came here to see whether in the future we will have to go into battle with a lawyer," a concern that was repeated after the raid on Gaza in 2009. Such information would have hindered what seems to be the aim of the report, to fully legitimate the government, the court, and the army, while delegitimating the killers as marginal members of society who do not represent Israel in any way, and who supposedly acted independently of the organization that had set them to do the task. This impression is also achieved by providing the conditions while omitting the reasons for the massacre, so it would not seem pre-planned in the high windows. The orders given to the soldiers are presented as the murderer's argument, and not as fact. Given the missing facts, we would have had the following explanation. 1. Israel wanted to conceal the fact that it was going to attack Egypt and encourage an auto-transfer of its Palestinian citizens to Jordan. 2. Israel considered that attacking Palestinian villages and killing some would divert attention away from the real war and encourage the rest of the Palestinians to flee to Jordan. 3. Therefore, the curfew was changed without the villagers' knowledge, and Army Colonel Shadmi ordered the border guards through their direct commander, Major Malinki, to kill anyone who would be outside after 5 p.m. This report, given in regular history books, has not yet found its way into textbooks, for it could shake the reputation of the IDF as a moral army that Israeli education is so keen to propagate. Not just a moral army, the most moral army in the world. This justification is necessary first because the same arguments legitimate present-day actions against Palestinians in Gaza and in the West Bank, and second because the students know that the perpetrators of the Kibbutz massacre have never been punished. On the contrary, some of them, like Ariel Sharon and Raphael Eitan, rose to the highest ranks of Israel's army and government. People who rose to such positions cannot be presented as criminals who have done unjustified wrong or are dissidents. So anytime there are these massacres, there are no consequences for that. So, at the end of chapters of Israeli school books, there are questions that are posed, right? What are some, when I read some of these questions, I couldn't help but laugh because they're so ridiculous because of the frame. When you read the frame, you realize there's only 2 or 3 ways that students are going to be allowed to travel in their thought process, but none of them critically examine the Palestinian perspective on things. Following the Second World War, so this is an example of a question at the end of a chapter. Following the Second World War, there were millions of refugees all across Europe who were forced to leave their homes, but they had rehabilitated themselves. Why, in your opinion, did the Palestinians not take care to rehabilitate themselves? Why didn't the Arab states help them? This question creates a reading position that legitimates Israel's policy regarding the Palestinian refugees through what Van Leeuwen terms conformity to norms. That is, if everybody else does that, and the Europeans did it to us, why can't we? Besides, if we could rehabilitate ourselves away from our countries of origin, why can't they? Furthermore, the question presents the Arab countries' duty to rehabilitate and integrate the Palestinians as a given, as a known and accepted fact. This presupposition reinforces the Israeli perception that the Palestinians belong to the great Arab nations and should be taken care of their own as the Jewish refugees were taken care of by Israel. And it's not a like for like. If you've taken the time to study the situation, it's not analogous. They want to present it as analogous, but it's not. One of the questions following this chapter presents a newspaper from 1956 whose main headline is 50 Egyptians were killed, 40 were taken prisoners, the greatest operation since the War of Independence. The questions are, 1. In what way can such a headline influence the morale of Israeli citizens? 2. Why did Israel choose to carry out reprisals, though they often involve the killing of innocent people? The obvious answers, according to Israeli norms, would be retaliation and deterrence, which contributed to the morale of Israeli citizens. In the same line, though less bluntly, Nava poses a question regarding these reprisals. Do you think the reprisals were enough to deter the Arabs from acting against Israel? So not were the reprisals morally right or wrong, it's do you think it was enough to deter them from acting against Israel? And the question isn't asked, well, why would they act against Israel? Because they're mad, irrational dogs and they just wake up in the morning and say, I want to kill Jews? Or could it be that they are morally and legally reacting and rejecting and resisting the occupiers of their land? Here's another question. How can one explain the case in which a unit of border guards shoots and kills Arabs who are undoubtedly innocent and without any mean intention? By naming the victims Arabs instead of farmers, families, land laborers, both questions reframe the victim through genericization as the enemy, ignoring or backgrounding the existence of 17 women and 11 children aged 8 to 15 who were slaughtered. The suggestion to think in different directions presupposes the possibility of the existence of a reason to kill innocent children and their hardworking parents. I'll leave the conclusion to Nurit. I'm just going to read her conclusion. Despite researchers' arguments about critical tendencies during the 1990s and some attempts at showing the multiple facets of the intricate relationships between Israelis and Palestinians, Israeli current mainstream textbooks explored in this study present a simplistic and therefore incomplete picture, viewed from a single, committed perspective and conveying an unambiguous message. The land of Israel has always belonged to the Jews, even during the 2,000 years of their collective absence, and must therefore remain Jewish, in spite of international decisions and laws, and in spite of the fact that half the population under Israeli rule is Arab Muslim. So there's a lot more. If I had more time, I would get into, but it's a lesser known book. I think one of the lesser known books that I've covered in the last year, but I think something that would be well worth your time. There are parts of the book that get quite technical because it's an academic text, but there are other parts of the book that are not at all like that, and they read very straightforwardly. So I'm going to encourage you to get a copy of it. If you'd like to, there'll be a link to the description. There'll be a link to buy it in the description. That's one way you can support this channel. Another very easy way you can support the channel is by hitting like, subscribe, sharing this with people who you think are open-minded enough to engage with these ideas and hear what it is that Israeli children are actually being taught about Palestinians, if they're even allowed to be called that. Remember, they're just the Arabs. And if you really like my work, consider supporting using the YouTube members section or becoming a Patreon member. That's also linked below. A reminder that in 2024, a lot of all of the work that I'm doing on the channel, a portion of the funds that I generate are going towards the Palestine Children's Relief Fund. If you'd like to learn more about them, there'll be a link to the description below. They're a wonderful organization. They help Palestinian children who could not otherwise get medical care get medical care. There's also my Amazon wish list. If you want to pick out some books in 2025 for me to potentially review, you can take a look in there and see if any of those catch your fancy. Until next time, enjoy your reading.